Dark psychology is a study of the human psyche's most manipulative, deceptive, and controlling aspects, those shadowy corners of influence where morality blurs and persuasion becomes a weapon. This field explores the underbelly of human behavior, not to endorse it, but to expose and understand how certain individuals exploit psychological tools to dominate, coerce, and subjugate others, often without the victim even realizing it. From the cunning con artist to the emotionally abusive partner, dark psychology investigates what drives these manipulative minds and how their tactics operate subtly but powerfully beneath the surface of everyday interaction. It begins with an understanding of power, the silent hunger for control that drives manipulation. Unlike brute force, dark psychology relies on psychological weapons like fear, guilt, love, and trust twisted into forms of influence. These tactics are often invisible, camouflaged behind charm, affection, or rationality, making them far more dangerous. The manipulator doesn't attack the body. They infiltrate the mind. In this world, words are sharper than knives, and silence can be deadlier than a scream. The roots of dark psychology can be traced to ancient rhetorical techniques and philosophical manipulation, but modern study has brought it into the light with science-backed principles drawn from behavioral psychology, neuroscience, and social dynamics. One of the foundational ideas is that humans are predictably irrational, driven more by emotion and cognitive bias than by reason. Dark psychology exploits this predictability. It leverages confirmation bias, where people seek out information that supports their beliefs, and exploits authority bias, where people blindly trust figures of perceived power. It capitalizes on the psychological need for validation, love, and belonging, turning those very desires into levers of control. At its core, manipulation through dark psychology follows a pattern: establish trust, create dependency, and then apply subtle pressure to shape thought and behavior. These techniques are not limited to criminals or cult leaders. In fact, dark psychology is often practiced in ordinary settings, relationships, workplaces, even schools, by individuals who have mastered emotional manipulation to achieve their goals. The charismatic colleague who undermines your confidence while pretending to help, the partner who isolates you from your friends but claims it's for your own good, or the authority figure who weaponizes your self-doubt to maintain dominance. All are practitioners of dark psychological tactics. In this sense, the first step to protecting yourself is recognizing that the enemy may not appear as one. The charm, the warmth, the kindness, they could all be calculated moves in a larger strategy of control. This introduction serves as a wake-up call. Understanding dark psychology is not about becoming paranoid, but becoming aware. It's about sharpening your perception, recognizing manipulation for what it is, and learning how to think critically under pressure. As we go deeper into mechanics of gaslighting, love bombing, covert control, and trauma bonding, it will become clear that these are not abstract theories but real-world strategies used every day. Knowledge is the first line of defense, and in the realm of dark psychology, awareness is your armor. In this audiobook, you will not only explore how these tactics work, but also how to spot them, dismantle them, and protect yourself and your loved ones from falling prey to them. Whether you've been manipulated before or simply want to strengthen your psychological resilience, this journey will equip you with the insight, tools, and inner strength needed to navigate a world where not everyone has good intentions. Welcome to the hidden battlefield of the mind, where truth is weaponized, perception is distorted, and your best defense is knowledge. To understand manipulation at its core, we must first explore the psychological foundations that make it possible. How the human mind is wired in ways that make it vulnerable to covert influence. The essence of manipulation lies in the interplay between control and consent. The manipulator does not simply command. They lead their target to believe that the manipulated decisions are their own. This is accomplished by exploiting universal psychological triggers that govern human behavior, including fear of rejection, desire for approval, guilt, shame, and the fundamental need to belong. These triggers are embedded deeply in the emotional brain. The amygdala, responsible for processing emotions, and the limbic system, which regulates reward and punishment. Manipulators know this instinctively or through learned experience. If they can make you feel something strongly, love, fear, shame, they can control your actions without ever giving a direct order. For example, a manipulator might subtly question your memory, making you doubt your own experiences, a technique known as gaslighting. They may smother you with affection early in a relationship to lower your defenses, called love bombing. The success of such tactics hinges on timing, repetition, and psychological conditioning. The brain, when repeatedly exposed to a certain narrative or behavior, starts to internalize it as truth. This is the same mechanism behind advertising, propaganda, and cult indoctrination. Cognitive dissonance, another vital psychological principle, occurs when individuals are presented with conflicting beliefs or information, causing mental discomfort, rather than confront this dissonance. People often reshape their beliefs to reduce the conflict. This, too, is fertile ground for manipulators. By creating confusion or offering contradictory information, manipulators increase emotional vulnerability and reduce resistance. Additionally, manipulators use mirroring, subtly copying speech, gestures, or behaviors to build artificial rapport, making victims feel seen, understood, and connected. Neuroscience confirms that when we believe someone understands us, our brain releases oxytocin, the bonding hormone, which fosters trust, even if it's undeserved. Furthermore, the manipulator often adopts multiple personas, charming and generous in public, cruel or dismissive in private, keeping the victim in a state of uncertainty and emotional dependence. This unpredictability mimics gambling psychology, where inconsistent rewards generate the highest levels of addiction. Victims, like gamblers, keep returning for a win, the manipulator's fleeting approval or affection. In the context of dark psychology, these techniques are not random. They are systematically employed in stages, building trust, breaking down identity, creating dependency, and enforcing control. The victim's perception becomes shaped by the manipulator's narrative. Over time, the victim may even defend the abuser, unaware that their reality has been reframed through psychological coercion. In personal relationships, this can lead to trauma bonding. In organizational contexts, it can create blind loyalty to toxic leaders. From a neurological standpoint, prolonged manipulation can rewire neural pathways, making victims more anxious, obedient, and emotionally numb. It impairs decision-making by keeping the brain in a reactive state rather than a reflective one. This is why many victims of manipulation report feeling foggy, confused, or disconnected from their own intuition. They are not weak. They are neurologically hijacked. Awareness of these mechanisms is the first step to freedom. By recognizing the signs, emotional confusion, identity erosion, isolation, and over-reliance on a person's approval, one can begin to break the spell. The human mind is powerful, but it is not immune to influence. In the wrong hands, its strengths, empathy, trust, love, can be turned into vulnerabilities. That is why understanding the psychological foundations of manipulation is essential. It empowers you not only to identify manipulation in action, but also to rebuild the mental clarity and strength needed to protect your autonomy. In the chapters that follow, we will delve deeper into specific manipulative tactics like gaslighting, love bombing, and trauma bonding. Each is rooted in these foundational principles, and by mastering them, you sharpen your ability to see clearly, think critically, and reclaim control over your mind and life. Gaslighting is one of the most insidious forms of psychological manipulation, a tactic so subtle and calculated that it erodes a person's sense of reality over time without them realizing what's happening. At its core, gaslighting involves making someone question their memory, perception, or sanity, often through persistent denial, contradiction, misdirection, or lying. The term originates from a 1938 play Gaslight, in which a husband manipulates his wife into believing she's going insane by dimming the gas lights and denying that anything has changed. Today, gaslighting occurs across various relationships, romantic, familial, professional, and thrives in situations where the manipulator seeks control through psychological dominance rather than physical coercion. The process typically begins with subtle comments like, "You're too sensitive," "That never happened," or "You always remember things wrong," which slowly chip away at the victim's confidence. Over time, the manipulator escalates their tactics by outright denying facts, rewriting past events, or staging scenarios to confuse the target. The victim may start to doubt themselves, questioning whether they misunderstood or misremembered something, and slowly begins to rely on the manipulator's version of reality. Gaslighting often occurs in cycles, Moments of confusion are followed by temporary reconciliation or affection, which reinforces dependency and deepens emotional entrapment. This tactic is particularly dangerous because it exploits trust and emotional intimacy. The more someone cares for or respects a manipulator, the easier it is to fall into their web. In romantic relationships, gaslighting may manifest as a partner denying abusive behavior while insisting the victim is crazy or imagining things. In workplaces, it might involve a supervisor discrediting an employee's concerns or rewriting events to make them appear incompetent. In families, gaslighting often involves scapegoating or rewriting childhood events to preserve an abusive parent's image. What makes gaslighting so effective is that it's not always aggressive. It's often subtle, calm, and rational on the surface. The manipulator appears reasonable while the victim, feeling increasingly confused and emotional, begins to doubt their stability. This reversal of roles causes deep psychological distress, isolation, and even depression as the victim loses faith in their thoughts and emotions. The gaslighter may use others, family, friends, co-workers, to validate their narrative, a tactic called triangulation, which further isolates the victim and strengthens the illusion that the problem lies with them. The more the victim doubts their own mind, the more power the gaslighter gains. The manipulator's goal isn't just to win an argument. It's to dominate the victim's perception of reality itself, leaving them dependent and submissive. The early warning signs include second-guessing your memory, apologizing frequently, feeling overly confused in a relationship, making excuses for the other person's behavior, and constantly feeling like you're not good enough. Recognizing these red flags is vital to breaking free from the psychological prison gaslighting creates. Survivors often describe the experience as waking up from a trance or slowly escaping a fog, realizing that the confusion and anxiety weren't natural but engineered. Recovery begins with affirming your own reality, writing things down, seeking outside perspectives, and rebuilding your self-trust. Gaslighting thrives in secrecy and silence, so naming it is a powerful act of resistance. In the next part, we will explore the long-term psychological effects of gaslighting, how it damages self-identity, and how to begin the journey of healing. Understanding what gaslighting looks and feels like is a first step in reclaiming the clarity, confidence, and autonomy it attempts to destroy. The psychological impact of gaslighting runs deep, often leaving emotional scars that are invisible but profoundly life-altering, as it dismantles a person's sense of reality, self-worth, and trust in their own mind. When subjected to continuous gaslighting, the victim begins to internalize the manipulator's narrative, gradually replacing their authentic thoughts and memories with those engineered by the abuser. This erosion of self-trust creates a condition akin to psychological captivity, where the victim feels unable to think, act, or decide without first seeking validation from the gaslighter. The manipulator becomes a distorted mirror through which the victim views themselves, and over time, they may start to believe they're irrational, overly sensitive, or mentally unstable. This self-doubt becomes a foundation for dependency, where the victim feels incapable of functioning without the abuser's approval or guidance. As a result, gaslighting victims often become hypervigilant, constantly second-guessing their actions, emotions, and even facial expressions in a desperate attempt to avoid further invalidation. Their emotional landscape becomes one of anxiety, confusion, shame, and guilt. One of the most devastating effects is the loss of self-identity. The victim no longer knows who they are or what they believe, as their personality has been reshaped around the abuser's manipulations. This can lead to depression, dissociation, low self-esteem, and in severe cases, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, CPTSD. Victims might withdraw from social circles, lose interest in things they once loved, or feel emotionally numb. The gaslighter often isolates the victim intentionally, ensuring that the only feedback or reality the victim receives comes from them. Even when the relationship ends, the mental fog can linger, causing survivors to struggle with trust issues, indecision, and emotional dysregulation. Healing from gaslighting is a process that requires time, support, and deliberate self-rebuilding. The first step is recognizing that you were manipulated, acknowledging that the confusion and suffering were not due to personal weakness, but the result of psychological abuse. Therapy, particularly trauma-informed approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and EMDR, can be incredibly effective in helping survivors untangle the false beliefs implanted during the gaslighting experience. Journaling, Grounding exercises and reestablishing connections with supportive people are also key. Restoring trust in oneself is perhaps the most vital part of recovery. Learning once again to believe your feelings, honor your memories, and set boundaries without shame. It's common to grieve the lost time, the altered identity, and the betrayal experience at the hands of someone who is often close. Yet, within this grief is also the seed of transformation, the opportunity to rebuild a stronger, wiser, more resilient self. Survivors often emerge with heightened emotional intelligence, deeper empathy, and an unshakable commitment to personal truth. Gaslighting may attempt to erase a person's inner voice, but recovery is the act of reclaiming it, and speaking not only for oneself but for others still trapped in silence. In the chapters ahead, we will explore more manipulation tactics, how they interconnect, how they escalate, and how awareness can serve as both sword and shield against them. Love bombing is a manipulative tactic often masked as intense affection, overwhelming attention, and idealized romance in the early stages of a relationship, designed to create rapid emotional dependency and lower the defenses of the target. It typically begins with excessive compliments, constant communication, grand gestures, and declarations of love that seem premature but are framed as soul-level connection or fate. This overwhelming adoration can be intoxicating, especially for individuals who are emotionally vulnerable or have experienced emotional neglect in the past, as it fills a deep psychological void with what feels like genuine, unconditional love. However, beneath the surface lies a calculated strategy. By flooding the victim with positive reinforcement, the manipulator swiftly gains control over their emotional state and creates an artificial bond built not on mutual understanding, but on psychological intoxication. The love bomber often mirrors the victim's interests, values, and dreams, creating the illusion of a perfect match. They will often say things like, "I've never felt this way about anyone before," or "You're the only person who understands me," crafting an intense intimacy that makes the victim feel special, chosen, and deeply connected. This phase, though it feels euphoric, is not about genuine connection. It's about control. The love bomber is creating an emotional high that sets the stage for future manipulation. Once a victim is emotionally hooked, the dynamic begins to shift. The manipulator may suddenly withdraw affection, become critical, or introduce jealousy and insecurity, causing the victim to chase the high of the early love bombing stage. This push-pull pattern creates a powerful form of psychological addiction, where the victim craves validation from a manipulator and becomes increasingly dependent on their approval to feel secure. In many cases, the victim begins to justify or excuse the manipulator's erratic or hurtful behavior, clinging to the memory of how perfect things used to be. The emotional contrast between the intense highs of love bombing and the sudden lows of withdrawal fosters confusion and emotional instability, which deepens the trauma bond and entraps the victim further. Love bombing is not always romantic. It can occur in friendships, workplaces, or even cults, where leaders use charisma and praise to gain loyalty and obedience. The manipulator uses charm as a weapon, disguising control as affection. Recognizing love bombing requires looking past the surface and questioning the pace and intensity of the connection. Genuine love takes time to develop, respects boundaries, and involves mutual emotional investment, not overwhelming pursuit. If someone rushes intimacy, ignores your need for space, or makes you feel guilty for wanting to slow down, these can be red flags. Healthy relationships grow through authenticity, vulnerability, and respect, not theatrics and urgency. Survivors of love bombing often report feeling like they were swept away, only to later feel used, abandoned, or confused. The betrayal hits hard because the manipulator seemed so loving at first. But once the illusion fades, victims are left questioning their judgment, feeling foolish for believing in something that was never real. Understanding love bombing is crucial not only for identifying emotional predators, but also for reinforcing your sense of worth and pacing in relationships. In the next part, we'll explore how the love bombing phase transitions into subtle control and emotional dependence, and how to distinguish genuine affection from strategic manipulation. As the intoxicating phase of love bombing begins to fade, the manipulator subtly shifts gears, transitioning from admiration to control, initiating a dangerous cycle that traps the victim in emotional dependence and psychological confusion. This transition is often so gradual that the victim barely notices it. the once constant affection and attention begin to waver, replaced by criticism, emotional distance, or calculated neglect. What was once a flood of love becomes a drought, and the victim, desperate to regain the warmth they were showered with initially, begins to work harder to please the manipulator. This is the beginning of the control phase, where the love bomber strategically withholds affection as a form of punishment or motivation. The victim, now emotionally invested and hooked on the highs of the early relationship, blames themselves for the shift, thinking they did something wrong to cause a change. The manipulator may employ gaslighting at this point, denying any change in behavior, insisting the victim is imagining things, or accusing them of being ungrateful or overly sensitive. This constant shifting between affection and coldness creates a psychological trap known as intermittent reinforcement, a powerful behavioral conditioning tactic used to keep someone emotionally dependent by rewarding them inconsistently. The uncertainty of when affection will return keeps the victim in a constant state of anxiety and hope, always trying harder to recapture the idealized version of the relationship. This dynamic is incredibly addictive because the brain, craving emotional stability and love, becomes hyper-focused on pleasing the manipulator. Over time, the victim's self-esteem erodes as they begin to question their value and sense of reality. They become increasingly isolated, often losing touch with friends and family, either because the manipulator subtly discourages outside connections or because the victim is too ashamed to admit what they're experiencing. The love bomber may now begin to introduce elements of jealousy, possessiveness, or control disguised as concern. "I just worry about you. Why do you need to talk to them when you have me?" Or, "I thought you loved me enough to stay home." These tactics are not expressions of love, but tools of domination, framed to make the victim feel guilty for asserting independence. The manipulator may even use moments of vulnerability to further deepen control, such as comforting the victim only after they've caused emotional pain, reinforcing the idea that only they can heal what they've broken. In this way, they become both the poison and the cure. The victim becomes emotionally exhausted, constantly walking on eggshells, afraid to upset the manipulator or trigger another withdrawal. Their identity begins to revolve around the needs and moods of their partner, and their own needs become secondary, even invisible. Escaping this dynamic can be incredibly difficult, as the victim often clings to the memory of how things once were, hoping that with enough effort, the love they once felt will return. This is a cruel genius of love bombing. It creates a false paradise at the beginning, only to weaponize that memory against the victim as the relationship devolves. True healing begins with recognizing that real love is not conditional, not something you have to constantly earn through self-sacrifice and silence. It is steady, reciprocal, and respectful. Survivors must reclaim their right to love that does not hurt, manipulate, or control, and understand that the loss of a manipulator is not a loss of love, but a release from illusion. In the next chapter, we will explore the quiet yet equally destructive tactics of covert control, the silent weapons manipulators use to dominate without ever raising their voice. Covert control is a silent symphony of manipulation, a complex blend of subtle psychological tactics designed to influence, dominate, and diminish a person without direct confrontation or obvious aggression. Unlike overt abuse, which is visible and easier to identify, covert control operates in the shadows, through tone, implication, omission, and strategic silence. It thrives on ambiguity, making the victim second-guess themselves and creating an environment where control is exerted not through yelling or physical threats, but through emotional coercion, guilt, and quiet manipulation. One of the most common forms of covert control is guilt tripping, where the manipulator frames their disappointment or suffering as a fault of the victim, even if the victim did nothing wrong. This might sound like, "I guess I'm just not that important to you," or "After everything I've done for you, this is how you treat me?" These statements aren't about honest communication. They're designed to instill shame and pressure the victim into compliance. Another key tactic is passive aggression, where hostility is expressed indirectly through sarcasm, procrastination, backhanded compliments, or deliberate forgetfulness. The manipulator avoids responsibility while still causing emotional harm, forcing the victim to question their own sensitivity or intentions. Then there's triangulation, a powerful technique in which the manipulator introduces a third party, real or imagined, to create jealousy, insecurity, or rivalry. This can look like praising another person excessively to provoke envy or suggesting that others agree with the manipulator's critical view of the victim. The goal is always the same: to isolate the target, diminish their confidence, and reinforce the manipulator's control. Another covert weapon is mirroring, where the manipulator initially reflects the victim's personality, values, and desires to build rapid intimacy and trust. But once that bond is formed, the mirroring disappears, and the manipulator gradually replaces the victim's identity with their own preferences and expectations. Breadcrumbing is yet another method, offering just enough affection, praise, or attention to keep the victim hooked, but never enough to build security or genuine connection. This unpredictable behavior fosters emotional dependence, as the victim becomes addicted to the rare moments of warmth, hoping each time that things will return to how they once were. Even silence can be weaponized. Strategic ignoring, stonewalling, or sudden emotional withdrawal are all forms of psychological punishment meant to induce anxiety and regain power. These techniques are rarely acknowledged by the manipulator, and often the victim doesn't even recognize them as abuse until they've already begun to feel emotionally drained, isolated, and confused. The genius of covert control lies in its deniability. The manipulator can always claim innocence, twist the narrative, or accuse the victim of overreacting. This forces a victim to not only endure the manipulation, but also justify and rationalize it, deepening the psychological trap. Over time, covert control can lead to a complete erosion of self-worth, where the victim begins to feel incapable, invisible, or perpetually in the wrong. They may lose their voice, their confidence, and eventually their sense of self. Recognizing these behaviors is essential because they form the backbone of many toxic relationships, especially those that appear calm or functional on the outside. In the next part, we'll explore how manipulators take covert control even further through emotional blackmail and weaponized empathy, turning the victim's compassion into a leash and their kindness into a tool of enslavement. Emotional blackmail and weaponized empathy are two of the most deceptive and damaging tools in the manipulator's arsenal, exploiting a victim's core emotions, love, guilt, fear, and compassion, to silently control their behavior and dismantle their boundaries from within. Emotional blackmail operates through a formula of demand, resistance, pressure, threat, and compliance, often disguised as love or concern. The manipulator presents their desires as needs and their needs as crises, framing any resistance as betrayal or cruelty. For example, if the victim tries to assert a boundary or make an independent decision, the manipulator may respond with, "If you really love me, you do this," or "You're going to regret hurting me like this," suggesting dire emotional consequences for noncompliance. These statements are not expressions of vulnerability, but calculated moves to hijack the victim's sense of responsibility and morality. Weaponized empathy, on the other hand, targets the victim's innate kindness and emotional sensitivity. Manipulators deliberately present themselves as wounded, misunderstood, or broken individuals deserving of special treatment or forgiveness, even when their behavior is toxic or harmful. They may share sob stories, traumatic experiences, or moments of fabricated vulnerability to win sympathy, framing their emotional instability as a reason for their abusive behavior. "I've had a rough past. You're the only one who understands me." Or, "Everyone else gives up on me, but you won't, right?" are classic lines used to anchor the victim in a caregiver role. Over time, the victim begins to feel not only responsible for the manipulator's happiness, but also guilty for setting boundaries or protecting their own well-being. This emotional entanglement traps the victim in a cycle of sacrifice and self-denial, where any attempt at self-care is framed as selfishness, and any request for respect is met with emotional retaliation. The manipulator becomes both the fragile victim and the silent tyrant, weaving a narrative in which the victim must constantly prove their love, loyalty, and devotion, often at great personal cost. These tactics are especially dangerous because they mimic the language of emotional intimacy and connection, confusing the victim into believing they are participating in a deep, meaningful relationship. In reality, the manipulator is using empathy not to connect but to control, turning the victim's compassion into a weapon against them. The longer this dynamic persists, the more the victim's identity dissolves into that of a caretaker, fixer, or emotional hostage, unable to exit the relationship without feeling as if they are abandoning or destroying someone they care about. The emotional cost of this manipulation can be immense, leading to chronic anxiety, depression, codependency, and overwhelming fear of being perceived as cruel or uncaring. The path to recovery begins with recognizing that empathy does not mean enabling abuse, and love does not require the sacrifice of one's sanity or dignity. True compassion includes compassion for oneself, and boundaries are not only healthy, they are necessary. Survivors must learn to differentiate between genuine vulnerability and manipulative emotional bait, between being supportive and being used. Rebuilding from emotional blackmail and weaponized empathy involves reclaiming your right to say no without guilt, to feel without obligation, and to walk away from relationships that use love as a leash. In the next chapter, we will uncover the terrifying bind of trauma bonding, how cycles of abuse can create emotional addiction, and why victims often feel the strongest loyalty to the people who hurt them most. Trauma bonding is a deeply entrenched emotional attachment that forms between a victim and an abuser through repeated cycles of abuse, reward, and emotional unpredictability, creating a powerful psychological tether that feels like love but is built on manipulation, fear, and control. It's a paradoxical phenomenon in which the victim becomes emotionally addicted to the very person who is harming them, often defending or protecting the abuser even in the face of obvious mistreatment. This bond forms through a pattern of intense emotional highs and lows, moment of cruelty followed by periods of affection, apology, or relief, creating a neurological loop similar to gambling addiction or substance dependence. When abuse occurs, the brain becomes flooded with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. Then, during reconciliation, feel-good chemicals like dopamine and oxytocin are released, reinforcing the attachment and convincing the victim that the abuser is also their source of comfort. This chemical roller coaster conditions the brain to associate love with pain and resolution with submission, making the bond feel unbreakable. Victims often feel trapped by conflicting emotions. They know they're being mistreated, yet they feel an intense longing for the abuser's validation and approval. They cling to the belief that things will get better, holding on to fleeting moments of kindness, and replaying memories of the good times to justify staying. This cycle often begins with love bombing, progresses into control, and eventually spirals into confusion and dependency. The victim may become isolated, emotionally numb, or even ashamed, blaming themselves for the abuse or believing they somehow caused it. Abusers exploit these feelings with manipulative tactics like gaslighting, guilt-tripping, and shifting blame, further entrenching the trauma bond and eroding the victim's self-trust. Trauma bonding is not limited to romantic relationships. It can occur in families, workplaces, friendships, and even cults, wherever there's an imbalance of power and emotional manipulation. What makes trauma bonds particularly dangerous is their invisibility. From the outside, victims may appear loyal, loving, or devoted, when in reality, they are psychologically entrapped and emotionally broken. They may lie to themselves and others, making excuses for the abusive behavior or minimizing the abuse, because confronting the truth feels too painful or overwhelming. The longer the bond persists, the harder it becomes to break, as the victim's identity becomes fused with the relationship, and the thought of leaving triggers fear, guilt, and grief. Understanding trauma bonding is the first step toward freedom. It's not about weakness or foolishness. It's a survival response rooted in the brain's need for connection and safety, even in harmful environments. Breaking this bond requires disrupting the cycle, reclaiming emotional autonomy, and learning to recognize the difference between real love and toxic attachment. In the next part, we will explore how to begin that process, how to dismantle the trauma bond, reclaim your sense of self, and rebuild a life no longer dictated by emotional captivity. Breaking free from a trauma bond is one of the most challenging and courageous acts of emotional recovery, as it requires untangling deep psychological conditioning, confronting uncomfortable truths, and rebuilding a sense of self that has often been shattered by manipulation and abuse. The first step in dismantling a trauma bond is awareness, acknowledging that what you are experiencing is not love, but psychological entrapment disguised as emotional intensity. This realization can be painful, especially when the abuser has also been the source of occasional comfort or support. But it is essential to recognize that these moments of kindness are part of the manipulation, not evidence of genuine care. Once awareness is established, the process of detachment begins with setting boundaries, both emotionally and physically. This may involve cutting off contact, limiting exposure, or removing reminders that keep the emotional connection alive. No contact or low contact strategies are vital for creating the mental and emotional space needed to begin healing, though they are often accompanied by intense withdrawal symptoms, anxiety, guilt, longing, even grief. These feelings are not signs of failure, but signs of detoxifying from an emotional addiction. Support during this time is crucial, whether through therapy, support groups, or trusted friends. Survivors need validation and perspective from outside the toxic dynamic to counter the internalized messages planted by the abuser. Rebuilding identity is the next phase, learning to trust your intuition again, rediscovering what brings you joy, and reaffirming your values, boundaries, and personal goals. Journaling, self-reflection, and mindfulness can help reconnect with your inner voice, while affirmations and positive self-talk begin to rewire the inner narrative that may have been corrupted by years of criticism or gaslighting. It's also important to understand the triggers and patterns that allowed the trauma bond to form in the first place. Past trauma, unmet emotional needs, attachment wounds, so you can heal at the root level and avoid repeating the cycle in future relationships. Forgiveness, often misunderstood in this context, is not about excusing the abuser, but about releasing the grip that resentment and pain hold over your life. It is a personal decision and a process that happens on your own terms. Healing from a trauma bond is nonlinear. There will be setbacks, moments of doubt, and emotional relapses. But with persistence, compassion, support, survivors often emerge stronger, more self-aware, and more resilient than ever before. They learn that love should not hurt, that peace is not found in chaos, and that true connection never requires self-betrayal. Breaking a trauma bond is not just about ending a toxic relationship. It's about reclaiming your power, your voice, and your right to live a life governed by authenticity and self-respect. In the next chapter, we'll journey into the minds of the manipulators themselves, narcissists, sociopaths, and psychopaths, to understand what drives their behavior and how to identify them before becoming ensnared. Understanding the psychology of manipulators, particularly narcissists, sociopaths, and psychopaths, is essential for recognizing patterns of toxic behavior before they escalate into emotional entrapment, as these individuals operate with distinct traits that allow them to manipulate others without remorse, empathy, or accountability. At the heart of the manipulator's mind is a profound need for control, dominance, and validation, often rooted in deep insecurity, emotional detachment, or a complete absence of conscience. Narcissists, for example, are driven by an inflated sense of self-importance and a desperate need for admiration, which they pursue relentlessly by charming, deceiving, and using others to serve their ego. They lack true empathy and often see relationships as transactional. People are valuable only if they reinforce their grandiosity or supply them with attention. When a narcissist's image is threatened or their control challenged, they may lash out, withdraw affection, or employ emotional manipulation to reassert dominance. Sociopaths, while often charming and socially skilled, tend to lack regard for societal norms and rules. They manipulate impulsively and can form shallow attachments, but are quick to exploit others when it serves their purpose. They are more prone to erratic behavior, aggression, and calculated deceit. Psychopaths, on the other hand, represent a more cold and calculated version of antisocial behavior. They typically possess a high level of intelligence, strategic thinking, and emotional detachment, enabling them to mimic human emotion without actually feeling it. Psychopaths are often the most dangerous because they can study and manipulate their victims with surgical precision, often without displaying any emotional reaction themselves. While these labels differ in clinical and behavioral profiles, they share common manipulation tactics, such as gaslighting, projection, deflection, charm offensives, blame shifting, and intermittent reinforcement. What distinguishes these individuals is not just their behavior, but their complete lack of guilt or accountability for the harm they cause. They often justify their actions as necessary, deserve, or simply irrelevant, which is why traditional methods of confrontation or reasoning rarely work. In fact, attempting to reason with a narcissist or psychopath can further entrench their control as they exploit emotional vulnerability and twist words to maintain dominance. These individuals are adept at identifying and targeting empathic, insecure, or trauma-affected individuals, people more likely to doubt themselves or seek approval. They often initiate relationships with intense charm and attention, quickly establishing a bond before beginning the manipulation process. Over time, the victim becomes isolated, confused, and dependent, wondering how someone who seemed so perfect became so damaging. It's crucial to understand that these manipulators rarely change. The traits that define them are often ingrained and resistant to growth or empathy. The best defense is awareness and distance. Learning to spot red flags such as excessive flattery, love bombing, inconsistency between words and actions, boundary violations, and a lack of genuine accountability. Recognizing the mindset of a manipulator helps survivors stop blaming themselves, understand the calculated nature of the abuse, and take the steps necessary to protect themselves emotionally and psychologically. In the next part, we will examine real-world examples and case studies of these manipulative personalities in action, from toxic relationships to high-control leaders, and explore how their tactics unfold and impact their victims over time. Real-world examples of manipulative personalities, narcissists, sociopaths, and psychopaths reveal the chilling effectiveness of their tactics and the devastating impact they can have on individuals, communities, and even entire organizations, as their ability to mask true intentions behind charm, intellect, or charisma allows them to operate undetected for extended periods. One of the most classic examples is found in toxic romantic relationships, where a narcissist may begin with overwhelming affection, attention, and shared fantasies, only to slowly dismantle their partner's self-esteem through criticism, emotional withdrawal, gaslighting, and control. The victim often finds themselves isolated from friends and family, constantly apologizing and blaming themselves for the abuser's shifting moods or cruel behavior, clinging to fleeting moments of tenderness in hopes of reviving the person they initially fell for. In workplaces, a manipulative boss or co-worker might present as a confident leader or enthusiastic team player, but behind closed doors, they micromanage, take credit for others' work, and pit employees against one another to maintain control and power. They might praise one employee to create jealousy, lie about others to build distrust, or subtly sabotage anyone they perceive as a threat. Their leadership style is not about collaboration or fairness, but about preserving their dominance and ego. In families, a narcissistic or sociopathic parent can maintain lifelong control over children by alternating affection with guilt, comparing siblings to one another, or playing the victim to manipulate their children's decisions well into adulthood. The family dynamic becomes a web of obligation, emotional manipulation, and suppressed individuality. Cult leaders, authoritarian figures, and scam artists offer larger-scale case studies of these behaviors. Such individuals often exhibit traits of psychopathy or malignant narcissism, drawing people in with grand visions, emotional charisma, or the promise of salvation, only to exploit their followers financially, emotionally, or sexually. Historical figures like Jim Jones or Charles Manson illustrate how emotional manipulation, psychological control, and strategic fear can result in tragic outcomes when left unchecked. More subtle but equally destructive examples exist in religious institutions, political movements, or self-help organizations that use guilt, shame, and community pressure to enforce obedience and silence dissent. In all these cases, a common pattern emerges. The manipulator establishes trust quickly, exploits emotional vulnerabilities, isolates a victim from outside support, and then begins a slow erosion of the victim's confidence, independence, and sense of reality. Victims across all settings often report feeling confused, anxious, and ashamed, unable to explain what's happening or why they can't simply leave. What's important to understand is that these outcomes are not the result of weakness, but the consequence of expertly crafted psychological manipulation. These manipulators use emotional camouflage to create dependency and control, and the impact can be long-lasting, ranging from anxiety and depression to PTSD and identity loss. Recovery begins with awareness, validation, and support, which helps survivors begin to rewrite their narratives and reclaim their sense of power. Recognizing these patterns not only aids personal healing, but also strengthens society's ability to hold such individuals accountable before their harm spreads further. In the final chapter, we'll turn toward defense and empowerment, learning practical tools for spotting manipulation early, setting firm boundaries, and building emotional resilience so that you are never caught in another cycle of control again. In the final and most vital chapter of this journey through dark psychology and manipulation, we shift the lens from understanding the predator to empowering the prey, from exposing how manipulation works to arming yourself with the psychological armor needed to detect, deflect, and dismantle these tactics before they penetrate your mind, heart, or identity. This chapter is about taking your power back permanently. True defense against manipulation begins with the development of self-awareness, an unshakable foundation of emotional intelligence that allows you to observe your own reactions, thoughts, and vulnerabilities without judgment. Manipulators rely heavily on blind spots. Your desire to be liked, your fear of rejection, your need for validation, your belief in second chances, your compassion, and even your trauma. They hook into these aspects not because they are flaws, but because they are deeply human traits. Therefore, your goal is not to erase them, but to understand them so thoroughly that no one can use them against you. Begin by mapping your emotional triggers, those situations or statements that cause you to feel unworthy, panicked, enraged, or shamed. When you identify these responses, ask yourself, where do they come from? Whose voice is echoing in your head when you doubt yourself or feel small? Is it a parent, a past abuser, a culture, a religion, or an internalized belief from childhood? The more you bring these patterns into the light, the less power they hold over you. Once you've begun this self-mapping, the next line of defense is boundary mastery. Boundaries are not walls that keep people out. They are filters that let the right people in and keep harmful energy from distorting your center. You must learn to say no clearly, firmly, and without apology. No to guilt trips, to love bombing, to gaslighting, to walking on eggshells. Your boundaries don't need to be justified to anyone who respects them. Only manipulators challenge the concept of emotional autonomy. Practice stating boundaries aloud, writing them down, and noticing how people respond. Those who care for you will adjust. Those who seek to control you will resist. Their resistance is your confirmation. Emotional detachment is another critical skill. This does not mean becoming cold or indifferent, but learning to observe a manipulator's tactics without becoming emotionally ensnared. Like a chess player who sees the board 3 moves ahead, you begin to spot patterns in speech, inconsistencies in action, or manipulative framing. You learn to ask the golden questions silently in your mind. What is this person trying to get me to feel? Who benefits from this narrative? What happens if I don't engage? With each moment of clarity, you reclaim authority over your mind. Communication becomes your sword and shield. Learn to respond rather than react. When faced with gaslighting, try phrases like, "That's not how I remember it," or "We seem to see that differently," instead of defending yourself in desperation. When someone uses guilt as leverage, say, "I understand you feel that way, but I still need to do what's right for me." When love bombing arises, observe the pace and ask, "What's the rush?" Inconsistencies in story, timing, or behavior should raise internal alarms. If someone never takes responsibility but always plays the victim, if apologies come without changed behavior, if your needs are minimized or turned against you, trust the pattern. In addition to these defense tools, you must cultivate resilience, the psychological immune system that helps you recover quickly from manipulation and avoid falling back into old cycles. This involves surrounding yourself with truth-tellers, people who reflect your worth, challenge your blind spots with love, and model healthy connection. Community is an antidote to isolation, which is the manipulator's strongest weapon. Maintain relationships that are reciprocal, transparent, and growth-oriented. Therapy, mentorship, spiritual practices, or creative outlets can all serve as forms of emotional grounding and clarity restoration. Another powerful tool is gray rocking, a technique that involves becoming emotionally non-reactive when dealing with a manipulator. By removing their supply of drama, validation, or vulnerability, you starve their control mechanisms. Be brief, boring, and bland in your responses. Avoid explaining or justifying. The goal is not to win the conversation, but to exit the manipulative loop. Visualization and journaling exercises also rewire your internal narrative. Write letters to your past self from your present wisdom. Visualize a version of you who speaks firmly, walks away, or laughs off guilt tactics. Each time you imagine yourself victorious over a manipulative encounter, your brain begins to form new neural pathways of strength. Don't underestimate the power of microhealing. Every time you uphold a boundary, validate your feelings, or resist being baited into conflict, you heal a piece of your psyche. Healing is cumulative. The more you honor your truth, the less attractive manipulation becomes. Additionally, become literate in the emotional languages of healthy relationships. Real love is consistent, not intense. It respects space, doesn't demand sacrifice of identity, and grows slowly over time. Real friendship listens, gives, and holds you accountable without shaming you. Real leadership empowers rather than dominates. When you internalize these standards, anything that deviates from them becomes glaringly obvious. You become immune not by hardening your heart, but by refining your radar. Manipulators thrive on chaos, so your best defense is calm. They thrive on urgency, so your defense is patience. They feed on insecurity, so your defense is self-respect. You may not always be able to avoid manipulators, but you can always choose how to respond, how to protect your mind, and when to walk away. The greatest act of resistance is to remain whole in a world that benefits from your fragmentation. You owe no one your silence, your confusion, or your peace. In the final part of this chapter, we will go even deeper into long-term strategies for empowerment, how to rebuild identity, protect future relationships, and transform your pain into purpose so that manipulation no longer defines your story, but becomes the reason you reclaimed your power, your voice, and your freedom. As we step into the concluding part of this journey, Chapter 7, Part 2 becomes not just a continuation, but a transformation, a deep exploration of how survivors of manipulation, emotional abuse, and psychological control can rise not only to reclaim their lives, but to reshape their very identities into something stronger, wiser, and profoundly resilient. Healing from dark psychology isn't simply about escaping the manipulator. It's about reconstructing the inner architecture of the self, repairing the damage done to self-trust, reprogramming the patterns that once made us vulnerable, and choosing a life rooted in conscious strength rather than reactive survival. This begins with identity reconstruction. When you spent years accommodating a manipulator, your sense of self becomes blurred. You've internalized their voice, their rules, their distortions. So the first step is to distinguish between the thoughts that are truly yours and the ones planted by someone else. This requires ruthless self-inquiry. Ask yourself, who am I when I'm not performing, people-pleasing, or fearing disapproval? What do I truly value, believe, enjoy, and desire? Reconnect with forgotten passions. Revisit childhood dreams. Examine your needs without guilt. Begin to make decisions not based on fear or obligation, but on inner alignment. Rebuilding identity also involves changing your inner dialogue. After prolonged exposure to manipulation, the mind becomes conditioned to self-doubt, shame, and self-blame. Start to replace the internal critic with an inner advocate. Speak to yourself with the compassion, clarity, and firmness you once needed from others. Affirmations are not cliches. They are neurological rewiring, saying, I am worthy of peace. I trust my intuition, and I do not need to explain my boundaries. Every single day builds the emotional muscle needed to resist future manipulation. Alongside inner dialogue, the reconstruction of trust plays a critical role. You may have trusted the wrong people, but that doesn't mean your intuition is broken. It means you were trained to ignore it. Begin rebuilding trust with micro-decisions. Did you say no and it felt right? That's trust. Did you distance yourself from someone who drains your energy? That's trust. Celebrate these moments, because each one is a brick in the foundation of your emotional safety. The next vital piece is relationship discernment. Learning to evaluate people not based on charm, promises, or chemistry, but on consistency, empathy, and alignment. Observe how someone handles conflict, boundaries, and accountability. Watch how they treat others when they have nothing to gain. Real love will never require the erasure of your self-worth. Practice pacing new relationships. Don't rush intimacy or ignore red flags. The more slowly you go, the more clearly you'll see. Empowerment also requires narrative rewriting. The manipulator may have cast you as a villain, the weak one, the overthinker, the emotional wreck, but that's their projection, not your truth. Rewrite your story. You weren't weak, you were conditioned. You weren't overreacting. You were sensing danger. You weren't dramatic. You were desperate to be heard. Turn your experience into meaning. Some survivors become coaches, therapists, artists, advocates, writers, using their pain as a raw material for purpose. You don't need to monetize your healing, but giving your experience meaning will ensure it doesn't define you. It transforms you. Emotional regulation is another tool for empowerment. Manipulators thrive on chaos and reactivity, so cultivating calm under pressure becomes your secret weapon. Breath work, mindfulness, and nervous system regulation help you remain grounded when someone tries to bait you, shame you, or confuse you. Imagine your mind as a fortress. No one enters without permission. Detachment doesn't mean indifference. It means being centered in your truth while observing others with discernment. Alongside this, long-term empowerment requires a support system. Isolation is fertile ground for manipulation. So build connections that are based on reciprocity, emotional safety, and mutual growth. Share your experiences with people who validate you, not minimize you. Let yourself be witnessed in your healing. Community transforms recovery from an internal battle into a shared evolution. When you find those people, cherish them. Equally important is forgiveness, not necessarily for the abuser, but for yourself. Forgive yourself for staying too long, for doubting your worth, for needing love so badly you accepted pain disguised as affection. Self-forgiveness dissolves shame, and shame is a chain that keeps you tied to your past. Set yourself free. Finally, understand that empowerment is a lifelong practice. You will still encounter manipulative people, but the difference now is that you are not the same. You see the game, you know the moves, and you no longer play with people who don't respect your rules. You rebuilt your core, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. You've turned confusion into clarity, pain into purpose, and fear into wisdom. You are no longer a target. You are a mirror, a boundary, a storm wrapped in calm. You are proof that even after the darkest psychological warfare, it is possible not just to survive, but to thrive with your dignity intact. And as you move forward, remember this. Every time you speak your truth, choose your peace, walk away from toxicity, or teach someone else what you've learned, you are breaking a generational cycle of silence, control, and suppression. You are not just healing yourself. You are healing a legacy. This is the end of the audiobook, but it is only the beginning of your story. A story not defined by what was done to you, but by how you rose, rebuilt, and reclaimed your power one conscious choice at a time. As the final curtain draws on this journey through the shadows of human manipulation, what stands before you now is not just an end, but an awakening, a rebirth of awareness, strength, and sovereignty. You've walked through the corridors of dark psychology, illuminated the hidden mechanics of deceit, control, and emotional enslavement, and emerged with a deeper, sharper understanding of not just others, but yourself. You have stared directly into the face of emotional predators, not to fear them, but to disarm them with clarity. And perhaps more importantly, you have come face to face with your own conditioning, the silent compromises, the internalized guilt, the stories you were told about what love looks like, what loyalty requires, and what you must endure to be enough. And now, you know the truth. Love is not control. Loyalty is not self-erasure. Kindness is not servitude. This is more than knowledge. It's power. The kind of power that can't be stolen, seduced, or gaslit away. You now carry a weapon that no manipulator can touch. Awareness. The kind of awareness that speaks louder than any facade, that sees through charm, flattery, or crocodile tears with the calm precision of someone who has seen the patterns before and is no longer willing to play the game. And yet, as much as this journey has exposed the darkness, its greatest gift is not in warning you about what to avoid, but in showing you what you deserve to embrace. Authenticity, peace, respect, mutuality, emotional safety, and most of all, your own voice. A voice that was once silenced, doubted, distorted, or shamed, now reclaims its rightful place at the center of your life. And with that voice, you rewrite the rules. You no longer enter relationships hoping to be chosen. You choose. You no longer explain your boundaries. You state them. You no longer seek love at the cost of your soul. You seek love that feeds your soul. You are not here to be consumed by others' insecurities, projected fears, or manipulative demands. You are here to live, to feel, to express, to expand without apology. Let this conclusion be your contract with yourself. That from this moment on, you are loyal first to your truth, accountable only to your peace, and available only to those who see you clearly and treat you accordingly. You will still be tested. Manipulators don't vanish because you're aware, but now you'll feel the shift. You'll spot the red flags early, feel the gut warning when words don't match actions, and instead of wondering, what did I do wrong? You'll calmly walk away and whisper, not today. That is freedom. And it's not a one-time event, it's a lifestyle. A daily decision to no longer betray yourself for comfort, connection, or compromise. It's in the small moments. Saying no without guilt, letting go without explanation, walking away from chaos without needing closure. It's realizing that your healing doesn't require their apology, and your peace doesn't need their permission. You owe nothing to the people who fed off your confusion. What you owe is to the version of yourself who endured, who kept believing, who kept loving even when it wasn't returned. That version of you was not weak. They were surviving with the tools they had. And now you've upgraded those tools. You are not just healed. You are dangerous to those who hoped you'd stay broken. You are no longer a mirror for their delusion. You are a mirror for truth. And as you move into the world armed with this new vision, you will become a beacon for others, not by preaching, but by being. By living out the proof that it's possible to love again without losing yourself. To trust again without tolerating toxicity. To lead with softness and still stand like steel. This audiobook was never just about manipulation. It was about metamorphosis. About burning the old version of you that once made room for lesser love, and rising from the ashes more intentional, more whole, more untouchable. You are now your own guardian, your own healer, your own compass. The journey does not end here. It begins here. You are not what was done to you. You are what you do with it. You are the alchemist who took the poison of manipulation and turned it into the gold of self-knowledge. You are the storm that smiled at control and said, "You will not define me." You are the voice that broke the silence, the boundary that ended generations of abuse, the light that refused to dim just to comfort the darkness. And now, with every step you take forward, may you never again shrink to fit the cage you've outgrown. This is your time. This is your truth. This is your power. Walk in it. Speak from it. Live through it. And never look back.